Good morning. So, quick content warning. One, we've got zombies. You probably saw that one coming. There's a brief mention of suicide, although in fairness that's Camus and not me. And we've got a time-lapse video of a decomposing rabbit, which suddenly I feel very bad about that, saying it out loud. But by far most disturbing, we have existential concepts, the utter absence of God in a dizzyingly large cosmos, the total meaninglessness of human existence, and the imminence and dominion of death. So anyone who might be disturbed by any of those concepts, and really that ought to be anyone, is very welcome to duck out now with absolutely no hard feelings. Also there's inevitably going to be some adult language. So, no takers? Right, we're off then. So good morning, and thank you very much to all you intrepid, pasty, and most likely hungover souls who have undertaken to listen to me here at what is, without any possible doubt, the single very worst time slot on the Nine Worlds schedule, 9 a.m. on the Sunday. I actually didn't imagine there would be slots on the 9 a.m. on the Sunday until I was actually given one myself. Well, I may sound bitter. In fact, nothing could be farther from the truth. In fact, I'm profoundly grateful to be invited in and participating for the exact same reason I got the terrible slot, which is that I am a complete newcomer to the wondrousness that is Nine Worlds. My partner, however, the fabulous and currently supine Ness Thompson, star of stage and lectern, is a Nine Worlds habitué and serial presenter of long standing, and it was she who kindly suggested that I present a session proposal. The talk you're about to hear actually was originally going to be a blog post that I kept not getting around to writing for the outstanding reason that blogging pays so very, very poorly. But anyway, it was going to be this great apologia for the zombie apocalypse novel and why it's really a serious genre and art form. But anyway, as a talk, it gets me in here to hang out with you, cool kids, and it seemed like fun, and so here I stand. Though, off the bat, I probably ought to admit the first of my two very dark secrets on the day, which is that my geek credentials are actually extremely paltry. So I ask that you please bear with my profound sense of imposter syndrome. Also, I haven't done one of these in quite a while, and the last time I did, I completely bombed. I used to speak at conferences quite a bit, actually, in my past life and day job as an IT drone, and there you probably have pretty much the extent of my geek credentials. So, quick procedural note, there will be a QA at the end, as is customary, but I invite you to go ahead and just interrupt me, or, put your hand up, with any questions mid-session. I'd love for it to be a little more interactive. I don't want to stand on ceremony, and mostly, of course, it takes some of the heat off of me. So, since I am standing up here, who the hell am I actually, and by what right do I presume to lecture to you on either existential literature or, for that matter, zombie apocalypse novels? Well, for starters, I'm a survivor. Not thus far of any actual zombie apocalypse, but of something that at the time at least seemed far, far worse. Because I'm an idiot, I recently completed work on, or more aptly, get out from underneath, 6 years, 16 book, 1.6 million word project. A stupidly long and complicated series of not just zombie apocalypse novels, but, if it matters, special operations military zombie apocalypse novels. Now, you may accuse me of hyperbole if I make the claim that this project nearly killed me, but respectfully, you weren't there. And I'm still here, so why am I here? At core, the reason I'm here is because I'm always making apologies for the kind of stuff I write. Of course, this is the kind of thing that comes up at cocktail parties without let up. What do you do? Oh, you're a novelist. What kind of books do you write then? Sometimes I make the following little joke, that I used to have pretensions to be a writer of literary fiction, but then I decided I liked eating, paying my utility bills, that kind of thing. But you know what? Today is the day when the self-deprecation comes off. I'm going to stand up in front of all three of you. 3 is what I have in my notes here, because that's how many I was anticipating in attendance. And I'm going to say it loud and proud. I'm going to come out as a writer of zombie books, and I'm going to stop making apologies. Or rather, as the title of this talk indicates, I'm going to make exactly one more apology, and it's going to be session length. So this is an apologia for the zombie apocalypse novel as existential literature. We open with some general and deeply depressing observations. I mentioned the original pretension to literary fiction, as opposed to genre fiction, on the other hand. But the thing is, I strongly believe that all art shares a broadly similar function, and in particular, all the story arts, fiction, film, theater, television, whatever category streaming is in. Basically, all storytelling has a very similar job to do, to help teach us how to be human, which, not incidentally, I think is a very difficult problem. It was put very well by the great Robert McKee in his book Story, which I think is much the best book on storycraft, and I've read way too many of them. He says, "A great work is a living metaphor that says life is like this. The classics make inescapably clear the problems all generations must solve to be human." So what are these problems? I would start with our own minds. At the core of things, our unprecedentedly brainy, obsessive, neurotic, and self-conscious nature. On top of that, there's the stark unlikelihood of our existence and continued survival at all in a universe that is literally unimaginably large, that, as far as we know, is completely devoid of any other life, and that, on the facts, is manifestly hostile to any manner of life, never mind the brainy kind. There's also, down here on this planet, the question of how to run the totally inevitable tension of being an individual with our own wants and needs, yet designed by evolution for an environment in which we could only survive by working together, i.e. the individual against society, or versus society. And then on top of that, or more aptly underneath it all, is the terrifying question of how to, cobble together some kind of meaning out of the capricious, arbitrary, and rather random nature of existence. But over time, I've grown to feel that ultimately the human problem is basically unary, and we can put it like this: how to live in a world in which you're born to die. How in God's name actually does one do that? It's a very hard problem. We can put it in another way, expanding slightly from one dimension to two, and say that the problem is to do with our vexatiously dual nature, to wit, how to be both an exquisitely sensitive spark of awareness, but irretrievably trapped in a dying hunk of meat. So it's crazy to be human. We're at once angels of infinite possibility and light and love and compassion, and we're also dying bags of meat. So the thing about a zombie apocalypse is it brings the whole meat aspect into extremely sharp relief. In real time, you actually personally become a banquet on the hoof, an object of constant and incalculable hunger. So let's drill down on that. Why are zombies? Well, actually, let's digress briefly. Just as another aside, I mentioned the pretensions. Personally, I'm not enormously fond of the Z word. In my own series, I avoided use of it wherever possible, which is a bit easier because it is a military series, and so my characters, inevitably adopted the ever-popular NATO phonetic alphabet slang. So zombies became Zulus, runners became Romeos, and the zombie apocalypse itself is the Zulu Alpha. Many of you out there may be familiar with the wonderful TVtropes.org. Yeah, show of hands? Yeah, lots of folks. I adore TV tropes. I find it just to be this amazingly bottomless well of storytelling wisdom and truth. They have a number of related tropes. Everything's deader with zombies. Our zombies are different, and most relevantly, not using the Z word. And those TV tropes aficionados of you out there will know that there's always a trope namer, which is usually the first known instance of the trope. And you guys probably know this one, but it's definitely worth playing.
I can see it, it's just outside.
Any zombies out there?
Don't say that.
What? That?
What?
That? The Z word, don't say it.
Why not?
Because it's ridiculous.
All right.
Are there any out there, though?
It's only a trope, of course, if it carries on, and it did carry on. Let me pause to note that, God, no, I am not going to The Walking Dead for anything in this talk. And don't even get me started about The Walking Dead. What we are going to, however, is honest trailers from Screen Junkies. And I'm sure there's some other honest trailers fans out there, but God, I love these guys. And basically, for me, hey, any excuse.
The Walking Dead. Enter the aftermath of a zombie apocalypse, where no one says the word zombie.
Walkers.
Lambrins. Lurkers.
Geeks. Corpses.
The dead. Spiders. Walker.
Walker. What do you call Mom?
So that digression and pretension out of the way, back to zombies, still very scary. Okay, it's been said by someone smarter than me, and truly I think, that zombies are uniquely scary for two reasons. One, everything recognizably human has been removed from them. That exquisite spark of consciousness we spoke of is snuffed out completely, and all that's left is the palpably dying bag of meat rotting in front of you. And two, it's not just anyone coming to devour you, it's your friends, neighbors, relatives, and loved ones. In Richard Matheson's I Am Legend, which we're going to come back to a lot, Robert Neville laments, "My own wife, coming back to drink my blood." Okay, so now everyone you know and love are simply regarding you yourself as the meat. That immortal angel spark made totally beside the point. And I think, personally, that that's actually why getting eaten alive, and I don't know that it matters too much whether it's by a zombie, a shark, or a bear, whatever, is probably the worst and scariest thing that can happen to you. Do you guys know the Grizzly Man? Werner Herzog made a documentary film. He was a guy, liked bears, imagined bears liked him, spent more and more time out in the wild hanging out with them until one horrifying night, the absolutely inevitable happened, and one of the bears got hungry and stopped regarding not just him, but also his girlfriend, whom he had drug out there, stopped regarding them as friends and started regarding them as food. And the whole thing was captured on audio from a video recorder left running in the tent. Weirdly, this is one of the few very salacious things that seems never to have leaked out on the internet, so I've never heard it. But I did read a very detailed account of it by someone who had, and I can tell you the details of this thing haunt my dreams to this day. I can never unknow it. And in fact, I wrote a whole extended sequence in one of my books that was inspired by that horrifying feeling. Anyway, so this is the worst thing that can happen to you, because in that instance, the universe stops regarding you as the spark, ceases to regard your humanity, and from that moment on, you, like the Grizzly Man, are pure meat, baby. Meat City, population you. Okay, so in the ZA, everything is trying to eat you. But in all stories, particularly sci-fi ones, what it really has to be about is the world all of us actually live in. And of course, in the world we live in, it's not just the big things that are trying to eat us, it's also the small ones, the microbes. And in the end, they will succeed. We all know how there was a content warning about being deeply depressing on the front of this. Just wanted to double check. We all know how we end up as worm food, or more accurately, microbe food. It's definitely worth pausing to note that in most ZA stories, zombies are created by a microbe, a pathogen, usually a virus. I do not regard this as coincidence. So in my own books, I have this wonderful Kazakh rogue bioweaponeer character, the one who caused the whole world to go down in the first place, with a high-priced designer chimera virus that ends up in the hands of idiots. He happens to be a blast to write, this wonderful insouciant voice that I feel like I can personally take very little credit for. And he describes the phenomenon of the bugs really well. So the bad news is yes, I'm going to subject you to some of my own material. The good news is you're not going to have to listen to me read it out loud in my flat, monotonic American accent, because early on, my then co-author and I sort of almost despite ourselves lucked into getting the services of this god of audiobook narrators called R.C. Bray. And his accent's great, and his performance is great. Anyway, so you get to listen to him instead of hearing me. I've also, unfortunately, taken the liberty of pairing this audio with some utterly horrifying, perhaps because utterly mundane, video of a dead rabbit decomposing. Just to set the scene briefly, the Kazakh's up in his mountaintop Dhaka engineering virus lab, kitted out, and he's marching up and down in front of enclosures full of his zombie test subjects, lecturing to them because they're the only people he has to talk to.
But whether bacterial or viral, fungal or parasitic, microbes are what I personally like to think of as the bugs. And the bugs, it must be remembered, rule the planet, and always have. He spoke with emphasis, and then paused significantly. He put his glass down on the lab bench, rose, and began pacing up and down before the enclosures. Of course, he said, gesturing with one hand, the other stroking his goatee. The bugs massively outnumber us on this ancient blue planet, and that's putting it mildly. The ratio is perhaps 1,000,000 trillion to 1. They've got us beat on longevity, too. Single and multi-celled bacteria have been going strong for 3.5 billion years, versus at most 200,000 for our own species.
Okay, regarding the poor rabbit, the Kazakh later points out that the only difference between us and the rotting hunk of carrion in the ditch is that we have an active immune system. In fact, a blindingly clever and creative and lethal one evolved over millions of years in our spiraling arms race with the bugs. But if yours happens to go down for even 5 minutes, the bugs will be having at you just exactly like the roadkill in the ditch, or our poor rabbit. Like I said, we are meat. Okay, so while the ZA is almost always caused by a plague, the bugs have been around scaring the bejesus out of us for a lot longer than there have been ZA stories. Most notably in Albert Camus' La Peste, the Plague. So this is, without question, a classic and a seminal classic of existentialist literature. But I'm going to make a more controversial claim, which is that it's also effectively a proto-zombie apocalypse novel, and perhaps the world's first. Note that this book came out in 1947, and I chose this is either a first edition cover or a very early one. And I humbly submit, what does that look like to you? I'd say nothing so much as a production still from the World War Z film. So not so much has changed. We can put it this way: what do you do when George Romero hasn't invented zombies yet? And the answer is, you work with what you have. Just go with the plague. Why complicate things? As one of my own characters notes, a zombie apocalypse is actually a lot like any other bad pandemic, except the already infected people hunt you down to infect you as well. In Camus' story, of course, the infected can still infect you and do so with verve. The town is quarantined, and when some townsfolk try to escape, they're shot by armed sentries. There's violence, looting, martial law. They are exiled from the world. Death is taking them. So pretty familiar stuff, right? Admittedly, fewer shaky cam foot chases and disembowelments, but I suggest to you the broad outlines are there. But then again, one character in the Camus story by the name of Qatar seems to flourish during the plague, for the reason that it gives him a sense of being connected to others, since everybody faces the same danger. That might sound familiar as well. Hey, it's the group.
Saddle up with the group.
The group seems supportive. This group is broken. I'm keeping this group together.
Featuring Rick, the leader, who stands by his decisions until he doesn't.
I won't leave again. I have to go.
Your place is here.
This isn't a democracy. We vote. We don't kill the living.
Oh my god, I love honest trailers. And again, just to stress, we are seriously not referencing The Walking Dead in a literary exegesis. We're taking the piss out of The Walking Dead. And that's something I hope we can all agree on. Okay, moving forward slightly, but still well pre-Romero, we have Graham Greene. And this may seem like another digression, a roundabout way to get where we're going. But Greene's one of my favorites, by the way. I've read almost certainly every word he wrote that ended up under any kind of a cover. But here's the funny thing. I swear up and down, and have for years, that if Graham Greene were alive today, he would absolutely be writing zombie apocalypse novels. And for the following reason, and this is the core of my constant apology, which is that the zombie apocalypse novel is this wonderful sandbox for the exploration of existential themes. This is me putting my cards on the table. So in real life, in the condition of mortality, death is stalking us through all our days. But in the zombie apocalypse, it's literally chasing you down the street. So I defy you to come up with a way to sort of literalize or concretize the mortal or existential condition any better than a zombie apocalypse. But as with Camus, again, the form just hadn't been invented yet, so Greene had to make do with the conventions available to him. I won't spend too long on this, but my favorite pet example is A Burnt-Out Case. So the star of this one is another Greenlandian tragic hero called Query, who has come to the end of life. He's come to the end of work, despite being talented, famous, and celebrated. He's come to the end of love, despite being successful with women. He's come to the end of everything. So what does he do? He goes down a river in the interior of darkest Africa in the Belgian Congo. He stays on it until the very last riverboat stop on the whole river, the end of the line. And what's there? A leper colony, namely, sick people with sores. And ultimately, he doesn't even find peace there. The absurdities and horrors of existence come and find him. But importantly, the end of life, the end of the line, and complete isolation. That's a theme that comes up a lot, especially for the last man on Earth. Sometimes you get a dog. Usually it's just you. It was, of course, World War Z. that formalized the notion of the last man on Earth is the LAMO, or the acronym for it. I've got one in my books, and the other characters are constantly saying, "Hey, LAMO," to his total bafflement. Briefly pausing to note my dashed hopes for World War Z. This is almost certainly the most popular contemporary zombie apocalypse novel. And so I went back through it, very hopeful that I could pull out some material for this talk. But what I found was that it's actually too modern, or rather postmodern, and self-aware to be properly existential. Although, if you haven't seen the World War Z Honest trailer, you are in for a real treat. But anyway, the theme of isolation, it seems to me, is echoed in at least one particular vignette in World War Z that I was able to pull out. And it's the one about the Chinese sub that defects. So they smuggle their loved ones on board, they take off, they flee the zombie apocalypse underneath the wide oceans. At a certain point, they rock up on a nice Pacific atoll with some other survivors. They trade nuclear power for back rubs. They do very well for themselves. Until one day, perhaps inevitably, they're tracked down by a hunter-killer sub from the Chinese Navy. Mayhem ensues. They're forced to flee. There's a big underwater torpedo fight. Everyone loves a good torpedo fight. And they win. But then in a tragic turn, they realize that the hunter-killer sub was captained by the son of the captain of our sub. So not only has our captain betrayed his country, but he's also just now murdered his own son thereby. Overnight, his hair turns white, his eyes go hollow, and, quote, "He was truly an old man now, broken, withered. The monsters that rose from the dead, they are nothing compared to the ones we carry in our hearts. From that day on, we ceased all contact with the outside world. We headed for the Arctic ice, the farthest, darkest, most desolate void we could find." So, geographically, pretty far from Quarry's leper colony in the Belgian Congo in Central Africa, but I would say thematically and conceptually it's not that far away at all. And in both cases, contra Sartre, and I just had to get this quote in here without any context whatsoever, but for obvious reasons. So contra Sartre, it turns out that hell is not in fact other people. Hell is the complete and utter alienation from other people. Hell is having no one. And when faith and hope are gone, and when the love of others is gone, there's nothing left but exile, perfect isolation. So, who do we know who's perfectly isolated? Robert freaking Neville. Yes, I know you purists will deny that I Am Legend is a zombie apocalypse novel, and there's probably some purists in this room as well. And of course, you're right on the facts. It's a vampire apocalypse novel, but vampires too are the living dead, or so Robert Matheson says. In the book. They're living dead, they're your loved ones, and they're all coming back to devour you. So I'm going to say that for present purposes, this is a ZA novel. I know the movie version mucked things up even more confusingly. Also note, this is a first edition cover, I think, for the paperback. Also note well that this came out a mere 7 years after The Plague in 1954. So 7 years from the first proto-ZA novel to the first real ZA novel. I may be wrong here, not being an actual, literary historian or playing one on TV. But I think we can agree in any case that Matheson absolutely nailed the isolation theme, and so did the production designer for the film. So, Antelope notwithstanding, that there is some proper isolation. And so is this. I actually did edit this clip down for brevity. I just failed to do it vigorously enough. Da-da-da-da, and in fact, the only reason you are still watching this is because the only thing cooler than Antelope in Manhattan is a lion in Manhattan. Yeah! Love it. So, back to the book, because this talk is, after all, about the ZA novel, not about questionable adaptations. Okay, so Robert Neville was a man utterly alone, filling the void of endless hours with equally endless whiskey and sodas and classical music. Smoked a lot, constantly checking the clock, the second hand sweeping slowly around the clock face as he waited for them to come back. The white-faced non-people, the living dead prowling around his house, looking ceaselessly for a way to get in. And his nightly prayer, "Dear God, let the morning come." think most of us have been there. So amongst the dead prowling around outside are his old neighbor and colleague Ben Cordman, constantly calling to him by name to come outside, to join them, to just, pack it in. And he considers this. Why not? It's the only way to be free of them, to become one of them. And it's inevitable anyway, right? Not to mention so much simpler and easier than the constant struggle to stay alive. So why doesn't he? Mainly because of the faint, forlorn hope that there's still somebody else out there, somebody else alive, that he's not, in the very end, alone. And that may be the only consolation in the face of a dead universe, one that's trying to eat you, and is ultimately going to succeed, the group again. Hemingway said, or at any rate the theme of For Whom the Bell Tolls is, that in the face of certain death, the only thing that gives life meaning is sacrificing for the ones you love. But Neville doesn't have anyone to love or to sacrifice for, so why then go on? That may be the existential question. Why choose to live in a random, cruel, arbitrary, absurd, meaningless universe, and one that in his case was totally hopeless? That he has no one is hammered home by the fact that it's not just the living dead rampaging outside. He's also walled in there with the ghosts of the previously living. The spectral absence of his daughter Kathy and wife Virginia, who both died early on. And this reminds us of our condition outside the ZA and the regular old condition of mortality, because we face not just the inevitability of death, there's also, arguably even worse, the inevitability of loss. Either at the point of death ourselves, or if we're less lucky before that, we are going to lose everyone and everything we care about in this life, all of it going away. My God, this is depressing. So many people are going to nip out and just shoot yourselves. It perks up at the end. So, quote, this is Neville. He stood against the wall, clubbing slowly and weakly at the plaster, tears streaming down his bearded cheeks, his bleeding hand pulsing with pain. Everything was gone, everything. Virginia, he sobbed like a lost, frightened child. Virginia, Virginia. It's also critical to note that he did not believe that death would reunite him with his wife and daughter, or else he would have checked out in a heartbeat. So why can't he believe that? Because, of course, yes, we're all pretty much post-God now, which is why we have existentialism in the first place. And I assume everyone in this room is sort of in that boat, although I shouldn't assume. But God, of course, handily solves all these problems of meaninglessness and absurdity, and death itself actually as well. God in heaven very neatly solved the problem of death by denying it exists. You don't die, you just go to the next place. So, again, most of us are bereft of that now, and of course, so was Robert Neville, even back in 1954. After his wife died, which was after his child died, he asked himself, quote, what was he going to do now? Choices seemed pointless. What did it matter what he did? Life would be equally purposeless no matter what his decision was, unquote. Now, I suggest that's a rather pretty statement of the existential condition. There's some less pretty ways to watch it, such as whether or not to kill yourself. So, in one of the most famous openings in philosophy, Camus began his 1942 novella-length essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, with the following claim, quote, there's but one serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. Now, I love this book, not least because it's, it reads like a prose poem, reads like a dream, just beautiful language, which is a deeply strange thing for such a heavy work of philosophy. But why I really love it is because despite the uber depressing opening, it actually ends on a really uplifting note and conclusion. So essentially, Camus' conclusion was, yeah, okay, there is no meaning or structure inherent in the universe. We haven't been put here but for any reason. There's no design, no purpose. God is not molded us in his image. Nothing's expected of us. We're terribly free. It's all arbitrary and silent. But that doesn't mean that there is no meaning in the universe. It just means that meaning is a human-generated phenomenon. Put simply, you have to roll your own. You have to create your own meaning and find your own reasons to live. This was echoed by Holocaust survivor, psychologist, and founder of logotherapy, Viktor Frankl, who in Man's Search for Meaning, he addressed the ever-popular question, what's the meaning of life? And he found a great deal of pretension in asking this question and said, instead, this is a question that life is asking you, and you answer it by how you choose to live. Okay, so What the ZA does is concentrates this problem and supremely focuses your effort. You've really got to find a reason to live. Habit will carry you along for a while, but it's just too damned hard staying alive in the ZA. It has to be about something bigger. Like us, ZA survivors have to roll their own meaning, find their own reasons, and usually that reason is about the people you're surviving with. So early on, the first decision Neville is trying to make is whether to submit to the law for health and hygiene purposes in the plague that says that all bodies have to be burned, but he doesn't think he can do it. Quote, he wouldn't put Virginia there, not if they killed him for it. How many people have followed this rule? How many husbands took the women who had shared their life and love and dropped them into flames? How many parents incinerated the children they adored? Okay, in my own series, which is profoundly military, it was these same human sentiments and attachments that brought them down.
During the run-up to the fall, the militaries were the last to go down. Military installations, walled, guarded, heavily armed, and generally designed to withstand attack, at first seemed the perfect anti-zombie bastions. But what finally brought them down was camaraderie, esprit de corps, the military brotherhood. Not a single American or British military base was overrun from the outside. They all fell from within. When soldiers were wounded, their brother warriors erred far, far too much on the side of bringing them back inside the wire, either not believing they'd been infected, or thinking they could be treated or at least controlled, or just credulously taking their word for it that they weren't bitten or scratched. They walked or carried their own doom right inside the walls with them.
Okay, so in the end, like my guys, Neville does defy the rules, and this bit just breaks your heart. When he lowers his dead wife into the illicit hidden grave he's dug, waiting and expecting to be shot at any moment for the transgression, he takes care not to let her head bump. But after that, drunk in bed for days, night after night, quote, he stared at the blackness. What's left, he asked himself. What's left, anyway? Okay, so now Robert Neville has got Camus' Sisyphus problem good and hard. Why not kill himself? He ponders, quote, the endless enigma of why he went on. Life was a barren, cheerless trial, giving no promise of improvement or even change. The thought of 40 more years of living as he was made him shudder. And yet he hadn't killed himself. There seemed no answer. Here he was with no future and a virtually hopeless present, still plodding on. Instinct, or was he just stupid? Unquote. So is the survival instinct enough? After all, it's pure instinct that drives the dead. That's more or less why they're not really alive or human. What does it mean to be human? How shall I live? It comes up again and again. How shall I live? Is love what it means to be alive? And what do you do when all love is gone? Well, Robert Neville decides eventually what he does is he has to take control of his own fate. No one is going to save him because there's no one else left. He has to figure it out, how to beat death, and that becomes his purpose. So he heads off into the science room of the public library to start doing research, but the instant he steps in, the first thing he sees is that before the end of everything, someone had carefully lined up the chairs underneath the tables, tucking them in precisely. And forgive me, this is his term, not mine, some maiden librarian, he figured. Quote, he thought of that visionary lady, to die, he thought, never knowing the fierce joy and attendant comfort of a loved one's embrace, to sink into that hideous coma, to sink then into death, all without knowing what it was to love and be loved. That was a tragedy more terrible than becoming a vampire, zombie, plague victim, bear victim, whatever. So back to other people, or more pointedly, to love as the great and perhaps only consolation for mortality. So getting past that and moving smartly into becoming a hack amateur third-rate microbiologist and immunologist, he reads a book on the lymphatic system. He reads stuff like, quote, the bacteria passes into the bloodstream, white corpuscles, defense against bacterial attack, and he gets it now. Quote, it was the germ that was the villain, the germ that hid behind obscuring veils of legend and superstition, spreading its scourge while people cringed before their own fears. And as he starts to figure it out, his mood lifts. Maybe he can fix this, and maybe he can even save some other people. He says to himself, quote, no longer will you be a weird Robinson Crusoe imprisoned on an island of night, surrounded by oceans of death. Now, again, if Camus or Sartre or Kierkegaard can improve upon that as a summary of the existential condition, I will happily eat my own 16-book series, a page at a time. He stops drinking, remarkably. Food starts tasting like something again. He's coming back to life because he's now got a purpose and is gaining the ghost of a sense of control over his fate. There were some bumps along the road, of course. We call these Act 2 problems. This talk, not incidentally and deeply unsurprisingly, had dire Act 2 problems. David Mamet says, yeah, you get lost in the second act. You don't even remember why you were born. So, after the dog dies, shit, forgot to include a spoiler alert. After the dog dies, he doesn't go on another bender, but he does, for some reason, flash back a year to just after he buried his wife. For the second time, actually. She came back after the first burial, knocking on their shared door. He flashes back to getting dragged by the elbow by some godly person. There's some other terms I might have used there but refrained, to an old-timey Christian tent revival. Except, of course, the apocalypse is on, so there's a renewed sense of urgency. The preacher, or I might say huckster, barks through the PA system. Quote, "Do you want to come crawling back from the grave like a monster out of hell? Do you want to be changed into a black, unholy animal, godless, night-cursed husks, creatures of eternal damnation?" And the frenzied crowd all screams, "No, no, save us." "Then listen to the word of God. Become as little children. Shout out the glory of Almighty God and His only begotten Son," yada, yada. I think you all know how it goes from there because God's back, baby. And so there we have it, the original and going away, eternally most popular solution to the existential problem, God. With God, of course, there is no existential problem. There's a design, a structure, a pattern. He has a plan for every one of us. There are rules. Mainly, there's a purpose. It's all fixed in one neat word, and that music is really loud. So maybe that's enough of the music. Yeah, we'll pretend we're on the next slide. Yeah, so the existential condition basically is a universe without God, and how the hell to live in it. So it should be no surprise that the God people, who sense their advantage when the shit is really coming down, tend to make big appearances in ZA's stories. They do so in World War Z. I'm sorry, I keep switching between the American and proper pronunciation of that letter. Speaking American again, God save me. But as in so many ways, at any rate, World War Z subverts the genre a bit. When the topic of religious fundamentalists comes up, and they're charged that people are interfering with God's will by fighting the zombies, the U.S. Vice President replies, quote, "Oh, I'm sorry, I gotta learn to be more sensitive, but for crying out loud, you really think the supreme creator of the infinite multiverse is going to have his plans unraveled by a few Arizona National Guardsmen?" So, like I said, too postmodern and self-aware to be properly existential, or possibly for its own good. In my own series, religious people believe God is punishing the world for its ungodliness, and I wasn't very original there either, for it's the same in I Am Legend. Quote, "God has punished us for our great transgressions. God has unleashed the terrible force of His almighty wrath. God has set loose a second deluge upon us, a deluge, a flood, a world-consuming torrent of creatures from hell." Book 10 of my series is actually called The Flood, so not so original there either. But this topic of sinfulness actually comes up a lot more broadly. The late, great Blake Snyder, in his book Save the Cat, there we go, which is subtitled "The Last Book on Screenwriting That You'll Ever Need," which is hilarious because he wrote 3 sequels. In Save the Cat, he breaks down the movie genres as he sees them, including a memorable one that he calls Monster in the House. This one has 2 moving parts, he said, a monster and a house. But it also had a special, optional, but frequently added on element, namely sin. There's the monster in the house and sin. It was usually some moral transgression on the part of the victims that brought the monster about in the first place. You'll recall that nuclear weapons created Godzilla. The greed of the business owners on Amity Island provided the hot buffet out beyond the beach for the shark. And it was mindless suburban conformity that made John Romero unleash the zombies. Quote, "He has opened the grave, he has unsealed the crypt, he has turned the dead back from their black tombs and set them upon us." Actually, that's the huckster in I Am Legend talking about God again, not Romero, who's some people's God. But, of course, God hasn't saved Robert Neville. God hasn't saved his family and isn't going to reunite them. And there he is all alone. Until one day he's not. Here comes the young woman, simply walking head down across the long field. Quote, "A woman, alive, in the daylight. Alive," he thought, "alive." There are a few awkward moments. He chases her across the fields at high speed. She's running away. When he catches her, she rakes her nails across his face. He slaps her, then drags her back to his... Okay, this is going downhill very quickly and getting a lot more rapey than I intended. So begging your pardon. But eventually things do calm down, and there's wine and listening to Schubert. But then Neville begins to worry that she's actually infected, and if she is, he's going to have to kill her. He starts to have dark thoughts. Quote, "Shall I kill her now? Shall I not even investigate, but kill her and burn her?" Such thoughts were a hideous testimony to the world he had accepted, a world in which murder was easier than hope. And that, of course, leads to the other ginormous problem with a godless universe, namely morality. When God inscribes the rules in a big book or a set of tablets, everything is easy. Do this, don't do that, here are the stakes, eternal hellfire, there's an enforcement mechanism. But when he hasn't done so, and you've got to make this stuff up as you go, you run into huge problems, starting with moral relativism, and if you're very unlucky, ending up with nihilism. Nothing matters, do what you like. In the existential condition, you enjoy a terrible freedom. Back to Camus again, and I know this one by heart. Quote, "At the end of all freedom is a court sentence. That's why freedom is too heavy to bear, especially when you're down with a fever, or are distressed, or love nobody." Unquote. That quote is from The Fall, which, not incidentally, is what zombie apocalypse authors overwhelmingly tend to call the collapse of human civilization when the zombies take over. So everything loops back, nothing is new. But with or without God, the other great arbiter of morality is, of course, society. And in the ZA, that's shot too. There's no sheriff. Okay, sometimes you get a sheriff, but I think he took the uniform off around season 3, which was also when I think about when things went to hell with that program. There's no hanging judge. So what morality do you cleave to then? As one of my characters said, the least interesting thing about a zombie apocalypse is the zombies. It's all about what it does to the living, which is why the title of The Walking Dead, of course, doesn't refer to the zombies, but rather to the survivors. What values, other than survival, do you live for? What are you willing to die for, or to kill for? What principles will you sacrifice for? Perhaps even the sacrifice of a loved one. Where do you stand after the fall? In the end, Neville doesn't kill the woman, of course, even though there's no God to punish him if he had. Neither of the two of them believe in God, which leaves the problem of who actually it is who's sticking it to them. "Why were we punished like this?" she asked. "I don't know," he answered bitterly. "There's no answer, no reason. It just is." So Camus' big idea was absurdity. What a bizarre and random and pointless tragicomedy, or perhaps shit show this all is. Man seeks meaning, Camus said. The universe answers with ringing silence. That's the absurd. But Sartre's take on the same territory was contingency. Things are the way they are because they are the way they are. It just is. We're just here. It's all just like this. Could have been a lot of ways. It's not. It's this way. There's no reason why. And we exist entirely by chance. Now, these two get that. And it is, of course, at this point of peak meaninglessness that Robert Neville and the woman, who is called Ruth, finally embrace. They realize they're all they've got. Quote, "Two people holding each other tightly in the lost measure of night, sitting in the darkness, pressing close together, as if all the heat in the world were in their bodies, and they would share the warmth between them." Unquote. So, yea, verily, the existential universe, which we see up here behind me, is a very cold one. And then, of course, they do the natural thing. They go get tested, or she does anyway. And it turns out, yeah, she is infected after all. And as this becomes clear, she bashes him over the head repeatedly with a mallet. Yes, thank you for laughing at that. We might call this love in the time of the zombie virus. Later, the infected come in, finally getting into the house. Neville is shot in the chest. He wakes up lying where they put him in bed, facing the end. Quote, "I'm going to die," he thought. He tried to understand that, in spite of having lived with death all these years, in spite of having walked a tightrope of existence across an endless maw of death, in spite of that, he couldn't understand it. Personal death was still a thing beyond comprehension. But in a wonderful twist, it turns out Ruth really did love him after all, and is horrified that it played out this way. And she tearfully asks him why he didn't leave when he had the chance, to which he replies, quote, I couldn't go. I was too used to the house. It was just a habit, just like the habit of living. So Santayana famously said that life is worth living is the most necessary of assumptions, and were it not assumed, the most impossible of conclusions. So zombie apocalypse, no zombie apocalypse, you've got to have some reason to go on. Is habit enough? Probably not. Neville stayed out of habit and he died. But much more tragically, love also wasn't enough to save him. But that, share session attendee, is where Richard Matheson and I part ways. My series of books from the outset was intended to be resolutely hopeful, in conscious, contradistinction to, say, The Walking Dead, which is unrelentingly grim. And the theme of the series is very clear, and it can be expressed in 3 words. Love conquers death. Yeah, that's a pretty funny graphic. I like that too. But what does that mean? Okay, so in the literal sense, in the story, it's only the love of it's only the love the characters have for one another that allows them to overcome impossible odds and literally conquer death. At the very second, as death, or rather the teeming hordes of the undead, are about to take the last of them and cover the entire planet, they miraculously beat the plague. They dig down because of this love they have for one another and miraculously beat the plague, kill all the zombies, and end the ZA once and for all. But of course, I already said that with all stories, particularly sci-fi ones, what it's really about is the world all of us actually live in. It's not about that imaginary world or those characters. It's about us. And what love conquers death means for us here in the real world is it's only the love we share with other people that makes a condition of mortality tolerable. So I humbly suggest that this is at least one thing that the ZA novel has to teach us about how to live in a world in which, just like the ZA survivors, we were born to die. And that lesson is, love as well as you can, hang on tight, and never let go. That, and obviously... Thank you very much. And we'll open it up for questions and comments.